This short video covers sinking funds. It's specifically covering problem ST3, Self-Test Problem 3, Chapter 7, page 251 of your textbook. Has to do with sinking funds. Recall what a sinking fund is. A sinking fund reduces risk to bond holders, the people who own bonds. And the way it reduces risk is it forces the company to somehow pay off, and there's various forms in how this works, to pay off bonds earlier, put money into an account with a third party, another bank, to help redeem the bonds in the future. Here's how, basically, the way I would think about it is, look, you start off at time t, time 0, and let's say a company borrows bonds for $100 million for 10 years. Now, 10 years is a long time. Who knows where the company will be financially, where its markets will be. And so if the company borrows $100 million today, remember how a bond works. You pay off that $100 million at maturity. So you collect the $100 million, you pay off. That's from the company's perspective. And along the way, there's interest payments. And that's how a typical bond works. Now, this is basically, in a sense, a balloon payment, because not only do you have to pay the last interest expense payment, but you also pay $100 million, this gigantic lump sum, a balloon payment at the end. That's risky. And it's the same concept like I talked about in a previous video of mortgages. If you borrow money with a mortgage through a bank, you're borrowing money in some cases for 30 years. The bank has no idea where you're going to be in 30 years. Or, not only that, but you don't even know where you're going to be in 30 years from now. So to reduce that risk, to mitigate that risk, mortgages require payments periodically, not just of interest, but of the principal. Okay? However, with regular bonds like we're dealing with here in sinking funds, there's only interest payments along the way, and there's this balloon payment of $100 million in principal at the end. And so to mitigate that risk, there's a couple of ways that a company can deal with it. It can have in its indenture, in other words, the contract between the bondholders and the company, it could specify that the company is going to redeem a certain number of shares, a certain dollar amount of shares each year. So each year it redeems and buys back a certain number of shares, and it'll specify how that buyback would work. It could be that the buyback works through open market conditions, where the company goes into the open market and actually buys the securities, or there could be a call feature in the indenture that not requires, but gives the company the option to redeem the shares, the bonds, periodically at par, typically par or maybe a little above par, depending on what the indenture says. So there's various methods in order to satisfy sinking fund requirements. There's an alternative sinking fund requirement which will pop up in the problem I'm going to talk about in a second, which is basically historical sinking funds. But let's jump into the problem, and then I'll elaborate on that. So here's the problem. It says Vancouver Development Company, VDC, is planning to sell $100 million. Sometimes it's good just to write down the basics here, the numbers. $100 million of 10-year semi-annual bonds. Okay. Let's see. The provisions for a 12%, and also don't forget 12% coupons. That's on an annual basis. Provisions for a sinking fund to retire the issue over its life will be included in the indenture. Okay, so in the contract between the bondholders and the company, this big legal document is written by lawyers for the company, and written by the bonds investment banker. It calls for a sinking fund provision. It'll retire some of the bonds over the life of the maturity of the bonds. Okay, sinking fund payments will be made at the end of each year, and each payment must be sufficient to retire 10% of the original amount of the bonds, the original amount of the issue. So in other words, so what it's telling you is the sinking fund provision is telling you it has to redeem or buy back $1 million. So it's $100 million divided by 10 years gives you $10 million per year. $10 million per year must be covered by the sinking fund provision. The last sinking fund payment will retire the last of the bonds. Okay, so there will be no more bonds left at the last payment in 10 years. The bonds to be retired each period can be purchased on the open market or obtained by calling up to 5% of the original issue at par at the company's option. Now, let's be careful here. I'll reread this. It says the bonds to be retired each period. It really should be saying each semi-annual period, okay, can be repurchased on the open market or obtained by calling up to 5% of the original issue. Okay? So that's the background. Now, let's answer the problems as presented, the questions presented in the text. Question A says, how large must each sinking fund payment be if the company uses the option to call at par or decides to buy the bonds in the open market? Okay, so part one. Okay, the sinking fund payments via the option, the call option, allows for 5% of the bonds to be called each period semi-annually. So therefore, the payments under that will be 100 million times 0.05, $5 million. Okay, so it says, so how large must each sinking fund be if the payment uses the call option? It's going to pay $5 million every semi-annual period. That's according to the last sentence in the setup for the problem. Okay, part two says, or yes, so part two is, or what happens if it decides to buy the bonds in the open market? Well, the company will retire the bonds in the open market using the least cost method. Okay, and what that means is it has a choice. It can redeem the bonds in the open market. Okay, open market, or call the bonds, whichever is cheaper. Okay, now the call option, this is the call option, costs $5 million. Okay, now the company's going to buy the bonds back in the open market if the bonds are selling at a price below par value, because remember, this is par value $5 million. So if bonds are trading in the open market at below $5 million, below par, then the company will buy back in the open market rather than call, because the open market will be cheaper. So when does that happen? That happens when interest rates in the economy are very high. When interest rates in the economy are high, that means bond prices are low. And so when interest rates, or you can basically say the yield to maturity, because that's basically the market interest rate and yield to maturity is the same here, then what happens is if the yield to maturity is greater than the coupon rate, the bond will be selling at a discount to par, which means it's cheaper to buy in the open market. Okay, so two different methods to redeem these bonds back, open market or call them. Okay, part two says, what will happen to the debt service requirements per year associated with the issue over its 10-year life? Now you got to get comfortable with the term. What does debt service requirements mean? Well, debt service requirements basically it's telling you how much is it going to cost you in terms of cash flow over each year in terms of interest and principal payments. So how do you service the debt, basically? You service the debt by paying off principal and interest according to the indenture. Now, debt service on a typical non-callable, no-sinking fund bond, the debt service for each year is typically just the interest payments. And then at the very last year, the debt service would be the gigantic balloon payment of $100 million in this example, plus the last interest payment. But here, when you have sinking funds, then the debt service will be a little different, okay? Because this fund has sinking, this bond has a sinking fund provision. Okay, so let's look at semi-annual periods. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Par value. I'm setting up a table here to answer the problem. Par value outstanding. Okay. Sinking fund. Okay. And the sinking fund provision calls for either, again, open market operations, open market purchases, or calling the bonds at par. Okay. Sinking fund. I'll just call it sinking fund. Redemption. Okay, so this is sinking fund redemption. My pen is a little thick in the point, so it's a little unclear. Interest payment. And then we have total bond or debt service. Okay. Service. Okay. Now, let's build the table. $100 million is the principal outstanding. Okay, no problem. Now, it says in the problem that the sinking fund requirement has to be $5 million. Okay, so that's $5 million, either open market or callable, has to get redeemed. Okay, so that means interest. So we keep that down. This will be fixed. The interest payments, recall how a mortgage works. It's basically the principal outstanding at the beginning of the period times the interest rate. The interest rate is 12% per year, but it's semi-annual, so it's 6%. And so 6% of $100 million is $6 million, which means the total debt service for this bond in the first semi-annual period is $11 million. Okay, so $11 million, $6 million of it is associated with interest payments. $5 million is the reduction of principal. And say if your principal is reduced by $5 million, that means it's going to start off next year. So it's $100 million minus the redeemed 5 gets you $95 million. Fixed redemption, $5 million required. Somehow, some way, it's got to redeem those shares. And then so the interest now will be 6% of $95 million, which is $5.7 million. So now total debt service, $10.7 million. And then next year, in our next semi-annual period, it's 95 minus what was paid back. So there's outstanding $90 million at this time. So $90 million times 6%, $5.4 million. So debt service is $10.4 million. And as you can see, debt service drops because interest payments are dropping over time in this example. Okay, interest payments are coming down. So that answers part B. Now part C is the old-fashioned method of sinking funds that I alluded to a little earlier. It says, now consider an alternative plan for VDC, this company, where it sets up its sinking funds so that equal annual amounts are paid into a sinking fund trust held by a bank, with the proceeds being used to buy government bonds that are expected to pay 7% annual interest. The payments plus accumulated interest must total $100 million at the end of 10 years, when the proceeds will be used to retire the issue. How large must the sinking fund payments be? Is the amount known with certainty, or might it be higher or lower? Okay, so this is a problem where you've got this is the old-fashioned way of sinking fund requirements, where the company's required to put some money into some third-party bank. It's a party that's independent of the bank, or a bank that's independent of the company and independent of the bondholder. So it's a third party, and so the company is required to put money into a bank account, basically, and that bank account will accumulate and buy bonds that are expected to pay, expected, that's the key word, 7% annual interest. That kind of gives you the hint to the last question. Is the amount of known with certainty, or is it higher or lower? Just look at that word expected. It's expected to pay 7% annual interest. So the company starts putting money into this bank, and the bank's buying up these bonds that are paying 7%, and it's accumulating all of that cash and all of that interest over time for 10 years, and then it's going to use that money to buy back the bonds in year 10. Well, again, another way of reducing the risk to bondholders, because you got this third-party bank that's helped facilitating the sinking fund. Okay, so the question is, how large must the annual sinking fund payments be? Well, this is, again, it's annual. It said annual this time, okay, according to the problem. So let's deal with it. This should sound familiar as a basic time value of money problem. Okay, so now what we have is we have to have a future value of $100 million. We have to have in the future $100 million to pay off these bonds. Okay, the question is, what are the payments that are going to be needed to do this? Okay, the interest rate on the account is 7%. Okay, the payments the number of payments is 10 because it's annual, as the problem says. Present value is set up to be 0 because there's nothing in the account right now. If you compute payment, what'll pop out of your calculator is 7.237750, or in other words, $7,237,750. So the company has to put in the bank, this third-party bank, deposit $7.2 million basically each year, and it hopes to be able to have $100 million at the end. And I said it hopes, again, it was implied with the word expected in the problem. You don't know where interest rates are going to be. They hope that those bonds that the bank will buy will earn 7%, but there's no guarantee. If interest rates fall, then those bonds will not be yielding 7%. Okay, so it's uncertain. Now the next part, D, asks, what are the annual cash requirements for covering bond service costs under the trusteeship arrangement described in Part C? Okay, so what are the cash requirements? And it says, note, interest must be paid on Vancouver, in other words, the company's outstanding bonds, but not on bonds that have been retired. Assume level interest rates for purposes of answering this question. Okay, so a couple of things here. It says it's telling you to look at Part C, right? And so it's telling you the sinking fund will be used at the end of the 10 years to retire the bonds. So this question, Part D, is referring to Part C and saying, look, you got this old-fashioned method of setting up sinking funds, a sinking fund requirement, where a couple of things are happening. One, the bonds, the bonds are outstanding the whole life, their whole life, and at the same time, those bonds are outstanding, and you have to service. The company has to service those outstanding bonds in the market during the whole life. They also have to service the sinking fund and deposit money of $7,237,750 each year. So what's happening is the service requirements for the company in this case are going to be the $100 million at 12%, that's the coupon interest, $12 million, right, is going to have to be paid just to cover the interest cost, plus the $7,237,750 to cover the sinking fund. So this is interest on the coupons and bonds that are outstanding in the market. Okay, interest on outstanding bonds. This is the sinking fund requirement that we just calculated. So the company is going to have to pay $19 million a year to cover all of the sinking fund plus the outstanding bonds. You can see now why this method is not used as much anymore, because look at the requirements. It's requiring $19 million. Not only are you covering the sinking fund, but also the interest outstanding. It's kind of like a double payment in a sense. Now, Part D, or no, excuse me, Part E says, what would happen to interest rates to cause the company to buy bonds on the open market rather than call them under the plan where some bonds are retired each year? Okay, well, it's asking, you know, which method do you use under the least cost method? Which method are you going to use? Well, if interest rates go up in the open market, in other words, the yield to maturity of the bond goes up, bond prices will go down, which means you're going to want to go in the open market and buy the bonds because they'll be trading at below par if interest rates are above the coupon. So if the yield to maturity is greater than the coupon, right, then the market, that says, look, the market wants this yield to maturity. And let's say the yield, just take a number, is 14%. A market wants 14%. That's greater than the 12% coupon. These bonds are not attractive, so these bonds will be selling at a discount. So you buy them in the open market at a discount. Otherwise, if that's not the case and interest rates are low, then it's better to go into and exercise the call option to buy the bonds or redeem the bonds at par value according to the indenture, and then you buy them back at $1,000 each. So you need to know where interest rates are to determine which is the least cost method. When I say interest rates in the open market.